As chief in Fort Oglethorpe of the police department, I think it's vital that our city leaders and our community understand what our officers do for them. Often they see those cars and they see their blue lights and working a wreck or writing a ticket or answering a call, but it's not often that a case of this magnitude that we hear about tonight gets heard. Sure, when it initially happens, but things stay so busy, people forget that a bad situation even happened a few days later. And I think it's important that we acknowledge our employees, especially soon after major offenses have been settled and it is made aware publicly that our officers have done a superior job. I think it's important that we take time and recognize them. And that's what I'd like to do tonight with our employees. Gary McConathy, captain at our agency, Steve Blevins, another captain at our agency, and Detective Sergeant Tammy Davis are worthy of being commended for these acts that were brought to our attention by an outside professional. District attorneys in our county took note of the unusual work that these persons did in these cases, as well as the families that were involved as victims. They noted as well. So it's important that our council understand the significance of their work in these events tonight. The first one I'd like to talk about involved the work of Captain Gary McConathy. In March of 2016, Captain McConathy and Ray Bowman, then, who we've lost, as you know, responded to the scene of an accident, a traffic accident fatality on Highway 27 in the area of the Sears shoe store vicinity, in which a motorcyclist was struck and killed by a driver that really shouldn't have been on the road in a vehicle that in no way should have been on the road. It was dangerous just to be out there. With the law as it is and as it was, it did not make it a clear-cut case by any means. And the situation was a terrible situation. The motorcyclist was doing everything by law that they should have, but they had their life taken by a person that seemed to have no care or concern for the safety of our citizens in Fort Oglethorpe. There was a chance that this case would not be settled, would be settled with a much lesser sentence, but due to the nature of Captain McConathy's readiness, his being studious, knowing his material, knowing his crime scene, knowing everything related to this case, he could get up on that witness stand and it be memorized what he needed to say, including traffic equations with hypothetical situations. All were prepared immaculately, and to his credit, he needs to be commended for it.
I had occasion to be the ADA assigned to a vehicular homicide case that Ray Bowman was the initial responding officer on and Gary McConathy worked. And I was the ADA assigned after we reorganized our office, and then I picked it up and saw it through trial to the end. Robert May was traveling on a motorcycle in March of 2016, and he was struck by a vehicle driven by Michelle Shirley at an intersection. He was killed on that day, and that was the case that I tried. The case originally seemed like a great case, but it was a little bit difficult because there were some issues that you don't normally see. Usually when we have a case where we're going forward on a first-degree vehicular homicide, we often have some sort of DUI, be it drugs or alcohol, or we have some sort of aggravating factor like excessive speed or street racing. We did not have any of those things in this case. We based the charge off of, in our conversations with McConathy and with Bowman, on the condition of the vehicle, and she had a lot of debris and various things stacked up in the dash of the vehicle that were obstructing her view. So it was a little unique in the sense that we didn't have the smoking gun. We did have great video from businesses, and there was a passerby who had a dash cam, but it was unique because this is not the sort of thing that juries expect to hear. They expect you to say somebody was killed as a result of this person driving under the influence or speeding, street racing. So it was unique. It was a first for me in my career. I did know that this case was going to be a challenge. The defendant was not somebody who was going to be terribly villainized by the jury when they looked at her. She was driving over the speed limit. She was not driving excessively over the speed limit. It was going to be a challenge to go forward with the condition of the vehicle, because basically we were trying to build several different things together to make this work. And like I said, normally you would have, you know, the causation is the DUI, and this was several different things: the condition of the vehicle, her failure to maintain it, the debris in the windshield that was obstructing her view, different things like that. So it was going to be a challenge from the start. I always will meet with a family when there is an actual victim in a case. In this particular case, I had met with Robert May's wife several times. When the trial was approaching, his brother was in contact with me, and Robert May's mother was still living. I believe she was about 90, and I brought them in and met with them to make sure that they understood sort of the pros and cons of what we had going for us. I always want to prepare the family that no matter how good the case is, no matter how much evidence I have, I can't ever say what a jury is going to do. But I assured them that I would do my very best. So we were all prepared, myself, McConathy. Of course, by the time this went to trial, we had lost Lieutenant Bowman when he got sick, but myself, McConathy, and the family all knew. The possible outcomes were, if we got the conviction on the first-degree vehicular homicide, then we had a sentence range of up to 15 years in prison. Otherwise, it was going to be a misdemeanor. And while we were prepared for that, we were hopeful, but we were all prepared for the fact that it might be a misdemeanor, which would carry a maximum of 12 months. I have been prosecuting for a decade. I interned in law school and prosecuted cases, worked on big stuff. I was incredibly fortunate. I was involved in a death penalty case that summer. I had a wide range of experience when I was in a metro Atlanta county. I've tried countless trials with officers of all different experience levels, and I took the time to sit down and write to you, to the police department, because Gary was so exceptional. Everything about the way that he handled the case was very rare in this line of work. I often have officers who, you know, they're very busy and they have a lot of things to do, and maybe they don't put in the time, the effort that they should. Gary was exceptional. He was such a rarity, and I felt like his superiors needed to know that, because oftentimes superiors are not in the courtroom. They don't see what happens in a trial, and they don't know. And unfortunately, the nature of the work is a lot of times the agencies communicate when there's a problem, not when there's something good to be said. And I wanted to make sure that that wasn't the case here. I didn't write any letters about any of the cases other than this one that I wrote on the Michelle Shirley case. And in fact, I have only written something similar to that one other time in my entire career. The fact that I've only done this twice in a 10-year career, I think shows how exceptional and extraordinary McConathy's work was on this case, and Lieutenant Bowman. They both did a wonderful job, and I am very sad that Ray did not live to see this through and see that his hard work got us a rare conviction. The fact that he was so accessible and so helpful was wonderful, but he went so above and beyond that with that many cases, and as we were talking about, so many things going on during a trial term, things are fluid. And I didn't know when this was going to go to trial, because one of the things that was a factor was that the defendant was not in custody, so she did not take priority over other cases. And we didn't know really until pretty close to term when she was actually going to go to trial. And when I told Gary, he said, "I'll be there." And I found out later that he and his wife had their house for sale, and their closing was scheduled for the morning that we were supposed to be picking a jury in this case. Gary never mentioned it until we were sitting there waiting to pick the jury, and he had in fact gotten with his realtor and explained that he had to sign the papers ahead of time or they would have to reschedule the closing because he would not be present. And that to put this ahead of something as important as selling your house so that you can then buy another house, I think speaks to his character and to how much he cares about his job. In terms of preparation for a trial, I've seen it run the gamut. I've seen people who prepared excessively for a very small case. I've seen people who didn't bother to read their reports when they came in. Captain McConathy really impressed me because he had gone through the report so thoroughly, and I also want to point out how involved this entire investigation was. I had a 5-inch folder that held the bulk of what I was using. Captain McConathy had 3 ring binders that stacked up to be probably 10 inches thick. He worked tirelessly. He reviewed everything, and when he was on the witness stand, he was as professional as any officer I have ever seen on a witness stand. He was able to testify from memory. I don't recall a single time during that trial that he ever asked to refer to his notes to refresh his memory. And he even went above and beyond in terms of the accident investigation and the reconstruction that he did, the math, the formulas, anticipating that the defense attorney might ask him X, Y, and Z. He had already pre-worked out a bunch of formulas and things like that. To his disappointment, she didn't ask those questions, but he was so prepared, and it was incredibly impressive to see the way that he testified and the way that he handled the defense attorney, who went after him and frankly attacked him in ways that were inappropriate. His training, his experience, things like that, and he handled it all with incredible grace, and just everything that she said, he had an answer for anything that she asked him, and no matter how nasty she was, no matter how she approached him, he always responded professionally, appropriately. He never took the bait for anything that she was trying to say that was inappropriate or accusatory. The level of professionalism, he maintained eye contact with the jury. I mean, it was just, he needs to be training people on how to do this, because his courtroom demeanor and the way that he presented himself on the stand was remarkable. McConathy's demeanor on the stand had a huge impact on how the jury accepted this and ultimately adjudicated it. He was so knowledgeable, and he gave them hard facts and numbers, which is something that juries look for. That's the world that we live in now. They watch CSI, they think that there's always proof of something, and Captain McConathy's formulations and his reconstruction was that proof that they needed. And I did have 2 of the jurors who contacted my office, contacted the district attorney to tell them how impressed they were with the level of preparation that we had when we went into the trial, and how Captain McConathy handled everything so well. He did a wonderful job, and I will stand by my statement that I made to the chief when I wrote the letter that I wrote, that we got the verdict that we got on that case because of Captain McConathy, not because of anything I did. I set him up and I threw the pitch, and he knocked it out of the park.
The other 2 employees I'd like to especially commendate tonight are Tammy Davis and Steve Blevins. They worked on a case involving James Leon Works Jr. Our charges, respectively, were serious offenses such as rape, aggravated sodomy, kidnapping, aggravated assault, and others. I think there were a total of about 22 separate counts on this individual. They had been plagued by this person with related crimes for numerous years before this one, but they knew this person was a dangerous individual, and when he offended again in this city, they set out that he would not get away with it again if they had anything to do with it. And they put the kind of investigation together that it takes for offenders like this not to slide through the system again, which he had done numerous times and gotten smacks on the hand, but continually offended on females. And in this case, they knowingly prevented another victim somewhere out there in our area from being offended against by this particular person. And he is a violent offender. This particular case went all the way through trial, just as well as Captain McConathy's case did. This one resulted in a life sentence plus 15 years. And he will have a long time before he's considered to get out and reoffend in this community. Their work in this case was instrumental, as our district attorney that worked this case had a chance to tell us. It was vital to the prosecution, the whole process. The years of work they put into this was very instrumental. And this kind of work is so significant for a community, because each one of these types of offenders just does not need to be in our city. And he will be off the street for a long time thanks to the work of these two persons in this police department.
My involvement with the James Works case, there was essentially an outstanding case that was from a Catoosa County case that was from 2013, I believe. And it was a case that had been passed between different ADAs. It was essentially, the top count was a false imprisonment case. And I became involved in that and kind of did a review of the caseload, and both Captain Blevins and Sergeant Davis were also involved in that case, I believe. And I became aware of the criminal history that this individual had and what he'd been doing in the community for going on 3 decades. And essentially, we couldn't get the victim in on that case to come in. And then December of 2015, this was almost a year of me possessing that older case. In December of 2015, I learned from Captain Blevins and Sergeant Davis that there was a new case that Mr. Works had committed, and this one was in Fort Oglethorpe. Mr. Works has a long history of committing crimes of a very specific nature within this community and the greater Chattanooga area. And these crimes go back to specifically within Fort Oglethorpe to the late 90s. There are convictions that this individual has going back to the late 90s, all involving women who were in his life, whether it was a relationship or friends of someone who he was in a relationship with. And this was an individual that for some reason not only knew how to pick the types of victims that it was difficult to get them to cooperate with the justice system, and we'll certainly go more into that as to why Captain Blevins and Sergeant Davis made such a difference with the victims involved in this case. But also, he just was one of these individuals who seemed to be extraordinarily lucky when it came to how the criminal justice system treated him. Even going back into the late 90s, both local prosecuting agencies and even crossing the state border into Tennessee had for some reason just treated this individual with kid gloves. Mr. Works faced a number of serious counts in the case that we tried in March of 2018, and also that dated back to this 2015 incident. The top 3 counts, all 3 counts were forcible rape. He faced a number of aggravated sodomy counts, kidnapping count, false imprisonment, several aggravated assaults, and also 3 or 4 possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. So some of the different acts that he had committed against prior victims, it was really important to have Detective Davis and Captain Blevins involved in this case because they knew that history. They actually had a history with a number of these victims. And these were egregious crimes that he committed against a number of women throughout our community and still live in the community. And one of the things that really stood out to us was just the level of violence, and the level of violence that would kind of essentially predate some sort of sexual act. It was almost as if the beating and the bleeding of his victims would then arouse him to then commit an act of sexual violence. Mm-hmm. And then you delve deeper into the levels of control that he would look to do with these women. And the most perfect example of that is essentially he forced a woman to strip down naked in the woods, dig a hole for herself, and essentially cover her up in that hole, challenging her to leave this area. Essentially establishing complete and utter control over this individual by saying, I can make you do something as insane and crazy as this, and you're bleeding in this hole alone, and you don't know if anybody's around, and you're going to stay there because I told you to. And it was that level of control, that level of violence that then led to his sexual acts that Captain Blevins and Sergeant Davis had a full understanding of. And throughout what we saw with this individual's history, he would commit a new case, and there would be detectives and there would be investigators and prosecutors that just didn't understand. They didn't understand that history. The role that Captain Blevins and Sergeant Davis played in this investigation was essentially an instrumental and kind of an indelible role throughout the course of this case. I think one of the things that I wanted to articulate to you in the letter was essentially that this case, not only would we not have had essentially an incident report, but this would have been a case that we would not have been able to take to trial without all the steps that they immediately took as soon as they knew that a crime had occurred. Some of those things that they did was essentially they not only knew the background of this individual and knew how serious to take the allegations that were being made, but they understood that the weaknesses that had been with the other cases that Mr. Works had had in the criminal justice system was that there wasn't enough evidence and we just had to rely on a victim's statement. And Captain Blevins and Sergeant Davis immediately understood that we needed a multi-agency investigation to bring the GBI in, to bring a number of different agencies in to make sure that we had not only physical evidence that we could send down to the crime lab, but also to ensure that there was scientific evidence that matched up with what the victim was telling them. And those were all things that they had to do immediately. And keep in mind that this is going on from December 18th to December 23rd of 2015. And they're having to do this all during Christmas, all during the holiday season. And instead of spending time with their family, they're making sure that they're taking a hardcore rapist off the street. And they've got to coordinate with a number of different individuals and make sure that they're putting together the strongest case that they can, and they did that. This was unique in the sense that there were so many other acts witnesses that you were essentially trying about 5 or 6 different cases. And of course, the way that the investigation came out, and again, this is where Captain Blevins and Sergeant Davis did a great job in getting the victim to come in very close in time for an interview, where during the interview you can see the injuries that she has, and you get an understanding of, over a number of different days, there are a number of different acts of rape, of aggravated sodomy, of aggravated assault that happened to her. And they have to take someone who's that traumatized, get the information out of them, and then essentially piece together what happened to this individual over a matter of 3 days. So not only was the underlying incident that was charged fairly complicated, but then you're trying 5 or 6 different rapes based on the other act's evidence that's coming in. And Captain Blevins and Sergeant Davis had to have an understanding of what that evidence was and make sure that they have successful interviews with all of those individuals, so I can then, as a prosecutor, review all the information and get an understanding of what I need to charge, what I need to notice as far as the other act's evidence, and then have an understanding of what those individuals' testimony may be, because I might not see them again, which was one of the underlying problems with this case, is getting cooperation from all these witnesses. This case was fairly uncertain as to whether it was going to trial, and they were playing, Sergeant Davis and Captain Blevins were playing an instrumental role in getting the victim to come in. And I think that rapport that they had built with her over a number of years, and knowing her and talking with her and building that trust with the victim, was the main reason that we essentially got her in the Friday before the trial started on Monday. As far as punishment for what James Works did in December of 2015, he is serving a life sentence in the Department of Corrections plus 15 years. He's not eligible for parole for 45 years. And one of the great joys of this trial was one of the other act's victims. After the trial, she ran in and was so overcome by emotion as far as what the sentence was going to be and what was going to happen to James Works, that she threw up. And there was this joke that we had that we've seen tears of joy. We've never seen throw up of joy before. And it's an incredible feeling to sit there and tell the family that for all intents and purposes, this individual is going to spend the rest of his life in a custodial environment, and he won't be able to victimize you anymore, and he's not going to have any new victims. So life sentence, 45 years until he's eligible for parole, then plus the 15. So yeah.